Good morning. We are very excited to start our second day of the Remote Work Conference. Without further ado, we are going to start with Lisa Ho, who is talking about bringing work home.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here early in the morning, and thanks so much to the organizers for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about bringing work home, flexible work arrangements as gateway jobs for women in West Bengal. And this is joint work with Suhani Jalota, who's a fellow here at Hoover, and Anahita Karandikar, who is a PhD student at UBC. We're motivated in this project by the large latent labor force in developing countries that consists of women who want to work for pay, but are currently out of the labor force for one reason or another. So if we add up the number of women who say that they would prefer to have paid work instead of or in addition to their current domestic responsibilities, we get into the hundreds of millions of people who could be in the labor force and yet are not. And that's people who say that they'd prefer paid work instead of or in addition to their current domestic responsibilities. So in addition to better fulfilling people's individual preferences, we also think that higher female labor force participation might be able to improve aggregate efficiency by improving the allocation of men's and women's labor, which is kind of what these recent papers have shown. And so to just give you a sense of kind of the magnitude of this issue in different countries, you can see that in countries like Sweden or the United States, female labor force participation is kind of higher than 50%, somewhere between like 57% in the US or 64% in Sweden. That decreases in lower middle income countries, and in India in particular, the female labor force participation rate is between a quarter or a third, depending on how you measure it. Okay, so why are there all these women who say that they want to have paid work, and yet they're out of the labor force? We hope to convince you that an important reason is that there's a mismatch between the jobs that are available and the jobs that women can or want to do given current norms of appropriate behavior for women. And one important axis of mismatch in this is the flexibility of work arrangements, and in particular, the ability to work from home. This mismatch suggests two potential strategies. We could either change norms so that women could take existing jobs while incurring lower costs, or we could change jobs so that even holding existing norms constant, women could do some kind of paid work while incurring a lower social or self-image cost to themselves. In this project, we're going to take the second approach and start by changing jobs, but we'll keep in mind that women's actual labor supply and attitudes that are kind of supportive of women working might be mutually reinforcing. So by changing jobs, we might in turn change norms kind of further down the line. So what does a job that's kind of closer to being appropriate for women in terms of what people's current beliefs are? One job that's particularly amenable to working from home and that's kind of an emerging form of work is digital gig work. So that's the kind of work that we're going to use in the study. We conduct a randomized field experiment with 1,670 households in West Bengal, where we introduce these home-based flexible work arrangements in the form of digital gig work, and we show three main results. So the first is that these jobs are highly effective at bringing women who were previously out of the labor force into paid work. The second is that these home-based jobs not only bring women in, but they can also act as a stepping stone to less flexible outside the home work. And the third is that we see a trade-off. So the workers produce output at lower quality, and they also produce work more slowly when they're working from home. In terms of the literature, we see ourselves as speaking to three main literatures. So the first is on strategies to increase female labor force participation. And we know from previous work that a lot of mechanisms, including psychological mechanisms, kind of household bargaining, as well as the available opportunities affect women's labor supply. But what we show is that even kind of compared to previously effective interventions to increase female labor force participation, work from home has an especially large effect on take-up of jobs. We also study a different feature of flexibility, which is multitasking work, or at least attempting to multitask work with childcare, which is something that many people became familiar with over the pandemic. Second, we're speaking to a literature on the selection into and treatment effects of flexible work arrangements that a lot of people in this room kind of helped pioneer and have been working on. A lot of that work focuses on higher skilled workers than the workers in our study, and also on higher upper middle income countries. And in this study, we're focusing on a pretty understudied population for this question, which is in a developing country, and these are workers who are kind of at a lower skill level. They're generally secondary school educated on average. We also know from high income countries that female workers value flexibility more highly than men do, and that contributes to the gender wage gap. But in a country like India, the gender wage gap is kind of a second order consideration to just the gender gap on the extensive margin of the labor force, just in terms of participation. And what we show in this project is that the differential importance of flexibility placed on it by men versus women is a big determinant of this gender gap in labor force participation. Okay, and then we also kind of speak to a literature on the determinants of gender norms. So we know from previous work that over the long run, economic conditions shape people's economic behavior and also kind of their gender attitudes. So for example, suitability to plow versus hoe agriculture. In this project, we'll test experimentally what happens when you change economic conditions to be kind of more suitable to women working and how that affects women's own as well as their children's gender attitudes. And then we'll see whether that shift in attitudes translates into a change in behavior down the line. Okay, so now I'll just give you some context on the study before going through our three main results. So our context is urban, peri-urban, and rural West Bengal. West Bengal is a state of India that's kind of on the east side of India, and the state has over 100 million people. So this is a really massive place that in a lot of other places in the world would just be considered like its own country. In general, the households that we're working with are kind of in the lower middle income kind of stratum, and to be eligible for the study, we were recruiting women who could not be in the labor force or in skills training. The idea being that in the absence of the study, they would be a housewife and continue to be a housewife. That means we have a sample of people who have very little previous work experience. So 2/3 had never worked for pay before the study. And these are not women who are particularly selected on interest in work. These were just women who were willing to take a survey. In addition, a lot of the women do not have final control over whether or not they are going to go to work. So about 1/3 of women say that they have the final say in their own employment decisions. And most of the other women say that their husbands would make the final decision about whether or not they work. In terms of household composition, so I kind of mentioned that women are often not the final decision makers in their own labor supply. Other people who often play a role are in-laws, and about 40% of women live with either a father or mother-in-law, and women also cite children as a reason for not working right now, and about 3/4 have a child under 18 years old. To give you a sense of what the current gender norms are, there are kind of widespread norms about pretty stereotypical family gender roles. So about 2/3 of women say that a woman's most important role is to be a good homemaker, that earning a living is a father's responsibility, while taking care of children is a mother's responsibility. And around half say that a man should have the final word about decisions in his home, which is relevant to women's labor supply because men have lower levels of support on average than do women for women working, particularly outside the home. So we'll aggregate responses to these statements as well as 12 more kind of similar statements to create a gender attitudes index. And then we classify households as either more traditional or less traditional in comparison to the median participant based on these responses. And you can probably imagine that if these views are widespread, if women themselves hold these views, if their husbands hold the views, if they're in-laws, it can be difficult for women to take jobs that are outside the home. And so what we do in the study is offer this emerging type of work that women could do from home in the form of digital gig work. Okay, so the actual jobs that we are offering, we do in collaboration with Microsoft Research and a startup spinoff that they created called Karya. And the tasks all involve speech recording tasks to contribute to either a Bangla or Hindi data set that is meant to be used to train speech recognition algorithms. The tasks that we use in the study are real job tasks that previous clients requested and paid for. And all of the jobs last for 1 month with a new set of tasks refreshed each week. We hired a separate team of validators to listen to every task and check things like, for example, does it sound like a woman is doing the job, or does it sound like there's a man's voice? We also ask validators to score each task on quality in terms of accuracy, in terms of volume, fluency, and whether there is background noise. Women are paid piece rate for these tasks with a maximum possible earnings of up to around 50 USD. On average, they don't earn that much. They earn about 2,500 rupees, which is 20% of their monthly household income. But that's still a pretty big difference from the baseline monthly household income that they started with. On average, women work for half of the days that they could, so 14 days out of 28, and they work for 22 hours on average. So this is very much like a part-time job. And to give you a sense of how this compares to other jobs that are available in the area, this is very generous pay compared to what they might make in doing kind of other types of casual labor. That said, this is the same pay rate that Karyo is paying to other people, mostly men, to do the same tasks. So we're just taking kind of the going rate that they're offering. Okay, so now I'll tell you about our first set of results, which is about the extensive margin labor supply response to job flexibility. What we'll do is we'll randomly assign households who we recruit into the study, either to a control group that receives no job offer, or to one of 5 jobs that varies in flexibility along 3 dimensions. So those dimensions are the ability to flexibly choose your work hours. So either you have to, each day, you can choose how many hours to work, or at the start of the study, you have to sign up for a particular shift, and then you can only work during that time slot for the rest of the month. So that's the first type of flexibility. The second is the ability to multitask work with childcare. So we tell some women that it's totally fine to have their children next to them while they work. We tell other women that they cannot have their children next to them while they work. And we listen to the speech recordings for children's voices in the background, and they're not paid for tasks when we can hear children in the background. The third dimension that we vary is the ability to work from home versus a nearby office. So we set up offices that are around like a 20-minute commute from their homes, and we also pay for any transport that they need to get there. So that paying for transport is not the kind of binding constraint. Okay, so what do we find? First, we find that among women who are randomly assigned to the office job, about 15% of them actually show up and start work at some point throughout the study. In comparison, about 48% of women who were assigned to the most flexible job show up and start work. So that's a more than 3 times increase, or a 33 percentage point increase. And to give you a sense of magnitude, that's a really large effect compared to other levers that have been studied, including correcting men's second order beliefs, or giving women more control over their earnings. It's also a far larger effect than what Suhani and I find in another study in Mumbai, where we increase wages about 5 times, from 5,000 rupees a month to 24,000 rupees a month, and find that that only results in about an 8 percentage point increase in women's job take-up. So in comparison, just giving women greater flexibility increases job take-up by like 4 times that. So our next question is to try to understand why there is such a huge effect on women's labor supply, and to understand what features of these home-based jobs are important. So first, comparing the office-based job to the least flexible work-from-home job, we find that working from home, even without being able to multitask work with childcare, doubles job take-up from around 15% to around 30%. Second, we find that work hours flexibility on its own makes basically no difference to job take-up. So what we take that to mean is that for these women who are out of the labor force, they can and they choose to set aside a couple hours per day to do paid work. So time is not the binding constraint for a lot of these women. Lastly, we also find that the ability to multitask work with childcare is also important for women's labor supply, and it increases job take-up by about 17 percentage points, or about 60%. So just to summarize kind of our takeaways on the labor supply response to job flexibility, the first is that flexible work from home jobs are just really effective at increasing out of labor force women's participation in paid work. This seems to be a really important determinant of whether or not they can work for pay. We find that the most flexible job more than triples take up from 15% to 48%. And then when we decompose the 33 percentage point effect of women whose job take up is marginal to this most flexible job, around half comes from the ability to work from home, and half from the ability to multitask work with childcare with no effect of time flexibility, conditional on being able to choose a time slot up front. Okay, so now I want to tell you about our second result, which is how home-based jobs act as a stepping stone to less flexible outside the home work. The mechanisms that we have in mind here are that women, husbands, their in-laws might update their beliefs about men's and women's abilities due to seeing women work, so they might learn from the previous work experience. And the second is that the demonstration of women earning income might also just change people's attitudes about what behavior is appropriate if we update that in response to what we see around us. We think it's particularly important to try to understand effects on labor supply outside the home because, especially in this context, many jobs are just infeasible to do remotely, so they have a lot more opportunities if they can work outside the home. And also, we might think that working outside the home would have larger effects on agency if meeting other people is important, for example, for having control over your life. The way that we measure effects on future labor supply, so after the jobs intervention, we conduct an end-line survey, and then 2 to 3 months later, we return to every study participant with another job offer. And those job offers, 5 of them are exactly the same as in the initial interventions, this digital work that has varies in work arrangements. And we also introduced 2 non-digital work options, which involve sewing masks and making jewelry to try to understand whether any effects on future labor supply are kind of digital specific, or if they apply to interest in paid work more broadly. The way that we test this is we take participants' job take-up in round 2. So did they start the job they were randomly assigned to 2 to 3 months later, and we regress that on the relative flexibility of their round 1 versus their round 2 job assignment. So what we call a gateway job sequence is if women were given a sequence of job offers so that their first job offer was more flexible than the second job offer. This is both conditional, so what we're doing here is we're conditioning on your round 1 and your round 2 job offer, and then using the random variation in terms of which job was more flexible. So what we find in the first row is this is the kind of what we call a gateway job effect, the effect of having conditional on your round 2 job, being randomly assigned a job in round 1 that was more flexible. And what we find among all participants on average is that being assigned a gateway job sequence increases take-up by 5 percentage points on average. In the second row, you can see that being assigned any other type of job sequence, so where the round 2 job was equally flexible or less flexible than the round 1 job sequence, has no significant effect on women's job take-up in round 2. We then also split the sample into participants who had previously had a work experience before the study versus those participants who had not, and this was their first time ever working. And kind of consistent with mechanisms that are related to learning, we find that the effect is kind of concentrated on women who had no previous work experience. So it seems like particularly for those women, having the opportunity to take a gradual approach to the job that they're offered in round 2 was really important. We also look differentially by the exact round 2 job that they were offered. So this table is the same as the last table, but now we separate out all of the different round 2 job offers that a participant might have been given. And we find kind of positive coefficients across the board for the different types of jobs that women are offered in round 2, but kind of concentrating on the one that's highlighted. This is for basically if you were offered a home-based job in the first round, what's the effect on your job take-up in an office-based job in the second round? And we find that being offered this gateway job sequence to an office job increases take-up by 8 percentage points. So you might remember from what I said before that we found that increasing wages by around 4 to 5 times in Mumbai also increased job take-up by around 8 percentage points. So this is a really large effect that we should think about in terms of magnitude. And also it means that it would actually be more cost-effective to offer an entire job from home for a month, have everyone do that, and then offer the same job from the office. That's a more cost-effective thing to do than to just try to get people to come to the office immediately by using higher wages. Okay, so now I want to tell you about what we think is happening behind the scenes and kind of what mechanisms are driving this gateway job effect. So we think that this could be driven by the way that actual labor supply and behavior and attitudes kind of mutually reinforce each other. So to show you what I mean, first we find that traditional attitudes are associated with lower labor supply and also increased importance of job flexibility. So in this figure, the purple bars are the women who come from less traditional households at baseline. The pink bars are women who come from more traditional households at baseline. So two things you can see. One is that the pink bars are just lower than the purple bars on average. So women from more traditional households are less likely to take up work. And also, the kind of slope in flexibility is much larger for women from more traditional households. So basically, traditional attitudes seem to mediate the importance of job flexibility to women's labor supply. Second, we find that in turn, the experience with working shifts attitudes to become less traditional. So among all participants on average, being assigned to the work group shifts attitudes by 0.05 standard deviations on average, and that effect is entirely concentrated on the women who were from more traditional households initially. So what that means is that it's women who are from these traditional households whose labor supply is most responsive to job flexibility, and also their attitudes, which are most responsive to work experience. We also survey children aged 8 to 18, and we ask them kind of whether their mother has a job, whether their father has a job, to see whether or not they notice that something has changed. And we do find that around half of the children whose mothers were working noticed that their mother had a job, and so we find a treatment effect on that. Kind of reassuringly, we don't see any treatment effect on whether children say that their father had a job. So this does seem to be kind of in response to their mother working. We also ask children about what their parents do around the house, and in the control group, about half of children say that their fathers have never done any cooking or cleaning or childcare. In comparison, in the treatment group, that kind of is reduced by 9 percentage points. So 9 percentage points more children say that their fathers did cleaning or cooking or childcare in the last month while their mother was working. So we find at least some movement on that margin in terms of whose allocation of labor at home. We also ask children very similar questions in terms of their attitudes to what we ask their parents. And we find that these are kind of noisily estimated, but it seems like children's attitudes might shift kind of at a similar magnitude to their parents, or at least among older children. Okay, so what do we find in terms of work from home as a stepping stone to outside the home work? So the first is just that faced with an office job, women who are first offered this kind of gateway job sequence are more likely to start work than women who have no chance at a gradual approach and are just immediately told that they should go work at the office. The effect is really large in comparison to, for example, a 400% wage increase that we found in Mumbai. And the effect is concentrated on women with no previous work experience. In terms of mechanisms, we think that it's because work experience changes gender attitudes. So women from traditional households have labor supply that's responsive to job flexibility to a greater extent, and it's their attitudes which change in response to work experience. Okay, in my last 5 minutes, I just want to talk about this trade-off that we see in terms of workers producing output at a lower quality and more slowly from home. So how do we actually measure this? First, we estimate the treatment effects of job flexibility on inframarginal workers. So essentially workers who are willing to do the job with or without the relevant dimension of flexibility. So how we do this is we take participants who were initially offered and accepted a less flexible job, and we return to them, and half of them we offer an upgrade to the most flexible job. So then we compare the job performance between those who were randomly selected for this upgrade to the most flexible job with those who were not randomly selected for the upgrade, but who also accepted an inflexible job. So the idea here is that we hold worker type constant. These are all workers who say that they will do the inflexible job, and then we just are randomly varying the actual job flexibility of the work arrangement that they do ultimately. On the selection margin, we kind of look at the other part of this upgrade. So to characterize what we call flexibility compliers, those are workers who are willing to do the job only if it's flexible along that relevant dimension. We compare the performance between participants who were initially offered and accepted the most flexible job with those who were offered an inflexible job but then were randomly selected for an upgrade. So the idea here is that we hold the actual work arrangement they're doing constant, the everyone is doing the most flexible job, and we compare performance between different worker types, the ones who are willing to work from the office but are working from home, and the ones who are only willing to work when they can do so from home. Okay, so to summarize what we find that work from home causes workers to complete tasks more slowly and with more errors. So among workers who say they're willing to work from the office, those who are randomly upgraded to work from home do so at kind of a slower pace, and they also make more mistakes. And that holds especially for more difficult tasks, and it also holds if we kind of do some bounds to account for the differential take-up between like after job acceptance to account for attrition. On the selection margin, we also find that workers whose labor supply is marginal to work from home complete tasks more slowly, although we find no kind of difference in terms of accuracy. So to try to understand what's causing differences in work performance between work from home and work from the office, we look at actual kind of the work patterns, because we have these data about exactly when workers are completing different tasks, how many attempts they made, what the quality of each task was. And if we take all of the data on the kind of tasks level data, and we define a work session as a continuous segment of work in which fewer than 10 minutes passes between consecutive tasks, what we find is that work from home causes workers to have shorter work sessions. So that's between the left bar and the middle bar. So workers who are working from the office work for about 40 minutes on average before taking a break. Workers who say that they will work from the office but then are upgraded to work from home work for about 30 minutes on average before taking a break. Then we find that comparing the kind of middle bar and rightmost bar, we find that work from home compliers also have shorter work sessions. So the workers who say they're only willing to work from home work for about 25 minutes on average before they take a break. Why do we think it matters that how long you work before you take a break? So we find evidence of flow effects. So here, the x-axis is the task within a given work session. So on the left-hand side is the first task that you do after sitting down and starting work. The rightmost side is the 200th task that you're doing after sitting down and starting work without taking a break in between. And then the y-axis here is the time spent on a given task. So what we find is that the first few tasks that you do take longer, and then kind of as you get into the flow of working, you're able to do tasks more quickly. So what that means is that interruptions are costly in terms of time. Similarly, this figure is the same, except the y-axis is now accuracy instead of time spent on a given task. And what we find is that when people first sit down to start work, they make more mistakes. And kind of as they get into the flow of working, they tend to complete their tasks more accurately, at least until like the very last few tasks that they're doing when there's like a sharp drop in accuracy as though they were interrupted by something. So to summarize what we find here, we find that there are negative impacts potentially of introducing job flexibility on worker performance in terms of quality and speed, and also that the people who are only willing to work from home have kind of marginally worse performance in terms of speed. And we think this has to do with interruptions to workflow when working from home, which means that potentially interventions that reduce the number of interruptions that people face working from home could ameliorate these effects. Okay, so just to conclude, the main takeaway from our study is that flexible work arrangements are highly effective at increasing women's labor supply. And that seems to be true both immediately, because there's some women who can only do work from home, and that's kind of their hard constraint. And also true because there are some women who would accept less flexible outside the home work given a stepping stone to do between unpaid at-home production and outside the home work, but they're just not currently given the chance to take a gradual approach. There isn't anything in between for them to do. In terms of implications for policy, we think flexible arrangements could be underprovided for at least a few reasons. So one is a lack of information. Employers might underestimate the size of the workforce that they're missing out on by not offering flexible work arrangements, or they might underestimate the skill level. In addition, we find, because of this gateway job effect, that there might be externalities that employers wouldn't take into account. So there are benefits to women and potentially other employers of offering this gradual approach to the labor market, but there's no reason for employers to take that into account when they might not be the kind of recipients of that gradual approach. And yeah, I think I'm out of time, but thank you.
I think we have time for one very quick question.
Okay, great paper, but I think you're too hasty in the inferences you draw from one of your main results, which is offering these gateway jobs leads you to more willingness to take up less flexible jobs down the road. Think for a second about a world with no norms at all. But you take a population in which you give them a low-cost way to experiment with something they haven't done before. They're going to revise their assessments of their ability and their enjoyment from work. Some will revise up, some will revise down. The ones who revise up their assessment are going to be more likely to take any type of job that's offered the next round. That's kind of the first point. Second, I think the norms probably are in play, but you want to unpack it a little bit more. There's internally felt norms of the person themselves, okay? And then there's the norms, the pressure that they may feel from husbands, in-laws, siblings, and so on. So I'd like to see maybe in the next study some unpacking of how these norms get revised from the experience effects that you document.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be great if we can kind of better understand whether the norms are the drivers of the effect or just like a result of experimentation. Because I think it is a bit like offering a subsidy to try paid work, essentially. And then some people revise upwards that actually paid work is better than they expected. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you. We are next going to hear from Maria Tito about does the ability to work remotely alter labor force attachment?
So thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited, and I'll continue the session to talk about the extensive margin of participation for the group of women. Let me start by pointing out that the views expressed are my own and do not represent those of the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve System, or its staff, so my usual disclaimer. The emergence of remote work and the normalization has brought the possibility, the potential for certain groups which attribute more value to flexible arrangements to experience better labor market outcomes. And we have been hearing about women. I'm going to focus on prime-age women and prime-age women with children. Another group, which Gordon will tell us later, is going to be people with disabilities. So all these groups have the potential to benefit more from this shift towards remote work. And in terms of revealed preferences, we actually do see that those populations tend to take up remote work more. In fact, the prime-age usage of remote work for women has been higher. For prime-age women with children has caught up to that of men, if we look at the current population survey data. And we combine this idea, the emergence of remote work, with the outcomes that we observe in the labor market. In particular, a recent note by Bauer and Wang, and as well as various news articles I'm sure you've seen, pointed out that if you were to look at the labor force participation rate among prime-age women, in the US we call prime-age women women between 25 and 54 years of age, has recovered pretty sharply in the aftermath of the pandemic relative to what happened to men. And you can see the red is the labor force participation rate for women, and in blue is the one for prime-age males. And there was a suggestion, or there was this idea, that remote work is responsible for these differential trends between men and women. And this is what I'm going to investigate in this paper, so the relationship between remote work and labor market outcomes for the prime-age groups, and also looking whether the pandemic has actually brought this progress, or whether this is more of a longer-term process. I also want to mention that in terms of how do we measure remote work, and I'm going to be a bit more clear in a little bit, we're not going to use usage. Of course, usage is contaminated by a lot of endogeneity in selection. We're going to look towards a measure of ability, so feasibility of remote work. Not the traditional measure that I've seen cited in your paper, but a different measure, and I'll explain why we prefer this new measure. Of course, there is a very wide literature. People are here that are continuing to push the barriers. It's been an honor to be at this conference because I've seen how the barrier gets pushed forward of the interaction between remote work and labor market outcomes, which is part of the vast literature on the labor market outcomes of women. And among those outcomes, one element that Pablo pointed out yesterday that has attracted a lot of attention, what we see around motherhood, the so-called motherhood penalty. And so we're going to try to contribute to that debate as well. So now let me move to the meat of the paper, starting with the data. And in terms of labor market outcomes, we're going to use two very standard data sets. We are primarily going to use the current population survey data, which allows us to observe high-frequency movement of individuals across labor market status. And there's also a pretty decent amount of demographics that we can rely on. The CPS, however, is a limited panel dimension, as you might well know. So you follow a household for 4 months. The household is then dropped for 8 months, and it is going to be on the sample another 4 months. In order to improve on the panel dimension, that's why we're going to go to a different database, which is the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from 1997, which follows a cohort of about 9,000 individuals, which were between 12 and 16 years of age as of December of 1996. And this cohort of individuals has been followed for several years, continue to be interviewed biannually. And so we have whole characteristics, an extensive amount of demographic characteristics and other characteristics for this group. The information that we're going to draw from this survey is on the extensive margin as well as on the intensive margin of their labor participation. It is mostly annual, unfortunately, with one exception. We're going to be able to leverage some weekly information that has been reconstructed by the survey based on their self-reported date of employment. This is all pretty standard, so let me move to the different way of measuring the ability to work remotely. So the measure that we are going to use is the one that has been originally proposed by Montenovo and others in 2020. And this measure is, again, based on the occupation characteristics that come out of the ONET survey, but looks at 3 different characteristics relative to Dingle and Niemann. So it looks at whether the use of memo, phone, or email is either very important or very important for your job. What do we think? This is a measure that actually captures what we usually think in terms of feasibility to work remotely. Well, first of all, I'm going to refer to the JPE by Jose, Nick, and Steve, where when they talk about remote work, they actually mention that when we think about remote work was originally a briefcase of documents, so it's the memo part, then phone calls that you would do, and then we have internet, which will be captured by the email. We've also matched the occupation characteristic with CPS, which is what we're going to use in most of the empirical analysis, and reconstructed, which is shown in this chart, what is the share of employment that is associated with the occupations that we define as having the ability of working remotely. And so here you see the evolution of the share of employment in those occupations. And it's been increasing, especially in the early 2000s, pretty steadily. It's been more constant recently. And this is more consistent with the limited survey evidence that we find from other sources. For example, in the 2004 Current Population Survey supplement, we have some information on what was the ability to work remotely. That was around 15%, which is pretty close to what these data imply. There is also some other limited evidence using the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from 2016-2017, or the American Time Use Survey from 2017-2018. And actually, the share matched pretty well from what you are seeing here. So these are going to be the main measure. Of course, it abstracts from the endogeneity of use. And various papers have taken that approach, although they've used the Dingle and Niemann measure, which instead, if you were to reconstruct the same full history that as we have done here, you would see that that measure has really been fairly flat, has only changed about 5 percentage points over this time period. I say, condition that you believe this measure, you believe that captures the ability to work remotely, then I can move on to the empirical analysis. The empirical analysis is really going to exploit the movements that we see in the data. And since I am a visual learner, Gabriel, can you press on the button? So let me show you what exactly is the design of the dependent variable that we are going to look at. In the current population survey, the labor force status is recorded. And so an individual can be either outside of the labor force, unemployed, or employed. And we're going to look at transition among those three statuses. And in particular, suppose that you are outside of the labor force at time t-1. And so we are going to compare individuals that move inside the labor force, that move either to U, so being unemployed, or to E, to being employed, to individuals that stayed outside of the labor force. So this is going to be a cross-sectional comparison. I would love to do to control for observed heterogeneity. Unfortunately, we don't have enough variation across that margin. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Can you press the back button? And so the dependent variable is going to look at all the different flows across status, and we are going to relate that to the demographic characteristics. So primarily, we're going to look at female, whether the occupation has the ability to work remotely, as I described, and the interaction between the remote ability and gender. And we are going to hypothesize that beta 2, so the effect of the remote ability is going to be improving labor market outcomes, and the sign is going to depend on whether you're going to look on the entry margin or on the exit margin, and similarly from beta 3. So there's going to be a differential effect for women on those margins. So let me move on at the results. So we're going to start by looking at the labor force. And the first three columns look at entry into the labor force. You were outside, you're going to move inside the labor force. Instead, column 4, 5, and 6 are going to look at exit. So you were in the labor force, and you're going to move outside of the labor force. As you can see, so I'm going to report only the three main variables. So first of all, if you look at female, we see some gaps, some penalties relative to men. So women in particular are more likely to exit the labor force. And this is consistent with what the literature finds. The second point I want to make, which is not novel, we found in a previous paper, is that if you look at occupation that can be performed remotely, you find there is an improvement on both the entry and the exit margin. So you should interpret this effect as for the omitted category, which is that of prime-age men. So you see that if you are in an occupation that can be performed remotely, you are more likely to enter, so it's positive coefficient, less likely to exit. And finally, you do see a differential effect for female only on the exit margin. Now, those coefficients are pretty small, and the way that I would think about those coefficients, however, is to relate to the penalty that women suffer on the exit margin.
So what time period is the data? Just this form?
Oh, it's since 2003 that yes, it's the entire time period. So if you compare the differential effect related to the penalty that the women have presented, exhibit to start with, you see that the differential effect take away half of that premium, about half of that premium. So this is the way I would more interpret the results. Let me describe what's the difference across the columns to give a sense of what type of controls, what can we control in these regressions. First, we have in columns 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 worker observables. Those are the characteristics like education, age. We also construct a proxy for the previous tenure of the individuals based on the various jobs that the individual held and reported. And also we have race and ethnicity. Second, we also have other occupation characteristics. So we include a face-to-face dummy that capture whether the job requires high contact intensity. Then we have a bunch of fixed effects. So there is month, stay here, industry year, and 2-digit occupation year fixed effects. Now let me move to the similar results. However, these are going to be on the employment. So the entry is going to be you were unemployed, you're going to move into employment, and exit, you were employed, you're going to move into unemployment. So here we continue to see the two elements of female suffering a penalty on either margin, that if you are in an occupation that can be performed remotely, that helps enter into employment and not exit out of employment. But we do not see much evidence of a differential effect, at least in terms of the employment margin. Maybe there is something on the exit, but it's only significant once we have all the controls here.
So just a quick clarifying question. What's the occupation of a woman who's not working?
Oh, so we don't have occupation for the entire sample. But if you have an occupation, if you have worked in the previous year, the occupation that you are assigned to is the occupation of the previous job. So
But what if you didn't work at all, then how? What?
then you wouldn't be in the sample because I need an occupation assigned.
People have
At some point in the past, they have worked, and that's how you're recorded as an occupation characteristics. So, of course, there are still endogeneity concerns. So the first attempt, as I was walking through the set of controls that we include, but we also do two other things. The first thing is we are going to restrict the labor market flows to happen within the same 4-digit occupations, and the result continue to hold. The second, we are going to define remote ability as of 2004. We choose 2004 because we have a slightly larger set of occupations relative to 2003, and also is the time period for which the remote ability measure is consistent with the survey evidence. And again, once we restrict the occupation to be remote, considered remote, only in the 2004 classification, we continue to see the significance of the effect on the exit margin of labor force participation. The last element, robustness checks that we do for those type of results is going to the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, where we can actually include the unobservable and heterogeneity. Here, the results, we find that the results are positive. In general, being an occupation that can be performed remotely is positive, although it's not significant on the extensive margin, but we find some significance on the intensive margin. So think in terms of hours or number of weeks worked. The last argument, which is a bit less poignant after Lisa's presentation, is that on the entry margin, I do not find anything. And so this could be consistent with the idea that maybe it's easier to argue that there's not as much selection on an observable in entering into the labor force based on an occupation that can be performed remotely. However, we're going to do other analysis, and so at least I'm going to convince you of the robustness of those results. So the additional results look at the presence of young children, and here, actually, I'm sympathetic to what Pablo showed yesterday, that you have flipped sign for men and women. Let me just point to what's the novel result. So for the novel part is when we look at the triple interaction here for prime-age women, which are an occupation that can be performed remotely, and that they have children of 5 years or younger. So for those women, we find a positive and significant impact in lowering their probability of exiting the labor force. For men, the sign is actually the opposite. So this is actually very similar to what Pablo has found. In terms of post-pandemic trend, when we introduce, again, another triple, quadruple interaction, and looking at whether there are differences between the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic period, we can't really point to much differences. So that's why I was arguing that this is more of a longer-term process rather than something that emerged only in the post-pandemic period. Okay, so this is the baseline result, but to convince you a little bit more, let me move into the implications, which are actually going to look at childbirth. So of course, we've seen that this is particularly important, is this particular evidence for impact of the access to remote work for participation on the exit margin. And we do know, based on literature, that this is childbirth is the time when we observe women leaving the labor force. So do we see that the effect of having access to remote occupation is particularly salient at that time? And the answer is actually yes. And that even that the mechanism actually works particularly through this channel. The first caveat, though, I want to introduce that this analysis is at this point done with the current population survey data, where you do not measure childbirth exactly. What the best that you can do is look at the presence of a child between 0 and 2 years of age. So at birth, in this table, is really whether there is a change in the presence in the child under 2 years of age. And so, given that caveat, so you do see that for a woman at the time of birth, there is a motherhood penalty, as consistent with the literature, so women are more likely to exit. But if they are in occupations that can be performed remotely, that motherhood penalty is reduced by half. And this sample, actually, because we have the additional variability in terms of the change in the presence of a child, we can introduce individual fixed effect and control for unobserved heterogeneity. But let me show you also, this time, the results with the NLSY 97 results. So Gabriel, would you mind clicking on the button at the bottom. Thank you very much. So here are the similar analysis based on what is the labor market outcomes that we can gather via the NLSY 97. And so the first two columns are going to look at employment status, whether the first column is employment status more generally. The second column is employment status conditional on having an employer, so exclude the self-employed. And then the 3, 4, and 5 are intensive margins of hours or weeks of works. And also the difference between 3 and 4 is 4 excludes self-employed work, hours of self-employed work. And here you find similar effect, so that the interaction between female and birth, where birth is precisely identified, so the interviewers report the month and the date of birth, you continue to find the motherhood penalty, but then if you are in an occupation that can be performed remotely, the motherhood penalty is reduced. The reduction is slightly smaller in the NLSY data, and it's about a third, but it is still there. And another thing that we can do, and that's why I was talking about the weekly data at the beginning, is looking at the weekly employment status and see how that changes around the month and date and year of childbirth. So these are two different regressions, so you can think of those as event status, which are run separately for the group of prime-age men and prime-age women. And 0 would denote the month in which you observe the childbirth in the NLSY data, and report the probability of being employed relative to the previous month. And you can see that we don't find any effect in terms of prime-age men, so it's completely flat. For prime-age women, only at 0, only at the month in which you observe the birth, you observe that the probability of being employed for those women relative to women that did not have children is actually higher. And so this is, again, points into directions that having access to remote work reduces the motherhood penalty for women. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Could you press the back button? OK, so then we actually move a little bit further. We continue to say, OK, we'll actually want to understand what are the mechanisms behind the impact of remote work for female around childbirth. And the possible mechanisms that we are going to investigate, here the evidence is going to be fairly suggestive, are going to be two. The first one is the interaction with paid parental leave. So the idea would be that if you are in an occupation that can be performed remotely, there is a substitutability in terms of parental leave. You do not need to have access to parental leave because you're a bit more flexible in terms of taking care of your children around childbirth. And the second one is going to be is going to be easier to engage in breastfeeding because you are remote and you have access to your child, and there's much less complications in terms of setting up breastfeeding. So let me start with the first analysis. So we're going to look here at the NLSY. So here we are really leveraging the extensive amount of information that are available in the NLSY data. And again, we're going to look at the sample of parents that experience a birth of a child. And we are going to compare those who have access to paid parental leave and to those who do not have access to paid parental leave. So this is everything conditional of having a child. And what you see is that when you look at the interaction between remote and paid leave, you do see that this is true not only for women, but this appears to be true more general. We see that the coefficients on the intensive margin, on hours in particular, are negative. And so this is suggestive to me that there could be a little bit of substitution at play. So you do not need paid parental leave if you have remote work, access to remote work, or vice versa. But again, this is very suggestive because we find it only for the interactions between remote and paid leave. We do not find an effect which is specific for female. The second and final channel we're going to look at is about breastfeeding. And here we went around and found another data set, which is this pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system of PRAMS data, which has a very extensive cross-section of characteristics of women around their pregnancies. And we used whether the woman took up to breastfeeding, and we aggregated the data at the state level. So essentially, we are comparing breastfeeding take-up rates across states and relative to the share of the employment in those states that can be performed remotely. So those are the type of regressions that are being run here. And the first column is just the correlations between those two characteristics, while the second column controls for a very extensive set of mother characteristics, father characteristics, birth characteristics, and child characteristics. So these are very extensive data. The main problem or the main weakness of this data is that we do not have a panel structure, so it's a repeated cross-section. So what you see is that there is a positive association. So you see that women in states that have access to remote work, there is a larger share of employment in those remote occupations, have higher breastfeeding rates, even controlling for this very large set of characteristics. And so I have a good time, so almost 5 minutes left. So I can conclude saying that the ability to work remotely has influenced the labor market outcomes and created particularly favorable conditions for prime-age women and prime-age women with young children. The outcome is really shown, at least in the evidence that we present, in terms of labor force attachment through a lower probability of exiting. And these gains, while were particularly important during the COVID pandemic, were mostly the result of longer-term trends. And there we can exploit the very long time series that we are able to construct to actually make this claim. And we find evidence of the remote ability, particular access to remote ability, is particularly important on the exit margin around childbirth. And we look at in various different data. And so because of that, so the very interesting policy implications in terms of how you could craft parental leaves in order to facilitate labor force attachment for women. And that concludes my presentation.
That was great. Super interesting. One question I have is just on magnitudes. So there's a simpler and a more complicated calculation. The simple one would just be how much, take your numbers as given, how much of the increase in female labor force participation you can account for post-pandemic. The more complicated thing is, given like your final bullet point, I think this thing's going to build over time. So in your data, you know how much an absorbing state exiting is after childbirth. I'm guessing some people that exit never return, and some that exit return, say, 10 years later. But you could look historically at the CPS, and I think it will mean the impact of work from home will actually grow over time. I mean, there's multiple margins. Also, disability, retirement. There are various margins where people don't exit the labor market and instead stay in, and so it will take years for this full effect to show up. But you could potentially estimate an even larger long-run effect, actually predict it out. I wouldn't be surprised this thing grows over time.
If you look at the, just a simple distinction, so to start with your second question, about labor force participation rates by disability measure, you do see that the improvement in labor force participation is almost entirely due to this remote ability category. So yes, I love to think how to implement that with the spinal structure, but it's a great comment. And also in terms of the decomposition, I haven't really applied these magnitudes, but I looked at very simple decomposition in terms of those two categories, so to construct the labor force participation for remote occupations and non-remote, and see how much they contribute. And this is another point why I don't think that these two factors have played a role in the post-pandemic period, because they did help with the drop, but the recovery initially was driven by the remote occupations, but afterwards, as the labor market got tighter, this is my story, I don't have a specific explanation, then this pulled in other women, even in non-remotable occupation. But it's a very interesting, and I'll look into it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, just wondering on the margin of entering into labor markets, do you have any hypotheses on why women aren't sorting more into occupations that are remotable if there's such good benefits for them for doing so?
Yeah, I guess I don't have the sufficient amount of data of seeing that. I mean, what I do see is that if you look at this ability measure, you look by gender, this discrepancy in terms of share of employment by gender in those two types of occupations really opened up in 2019. So this is where I see it. So opened up before the pandemic. So before, they were actually much more similar. So in response to that, I would say that, I mean, if I use the 2004 classification when I don't see much gender differences, I could control for that. But it's a very interesting question to understand why did the gap open in 2019? And it's, yeah, I'll have to think of how I can implement that, maybe with additional data sources beside the CPS.
I wanted to just encourage you to distinguish between the communication requirements of a job and the communication vehicles, which was your index you showed us. And it's very interesting that it trends up slowly over time. But that is distinct from the design of the jobs themselves. And for many, for many jobs, the job design is a choice at the level of the organization or sometimes the worker. And as you presented your stuff, you're kind of commingling those two. And so the reason this distinction is important is because even though there's a slow upward trajectory of the communication mix requirements across occupations, that was your evidence. We have lots of evidence that there was a rather abrupt change in the actual design of jobs in reaction to the pandemic, coming from survey data, coming from job posting data, and so on. So one of your bullet points, it seems to me, is a little, the second sub-bullet point you had in your concluding slide is kind of missing that distinction. And I think the first chart you showed us, or one of the first chart, does show an abrupt effect of men versus women labor force participation in the wake of the pandemic. And I think it's partly because of the job design effect and how that affects women's labor force participation, the central theme of your remarks. So I'd encourage you to think about that distinction a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's why I'm excited with all the people that they're tracking RTOs, because it's certainly something that I could incorporate in here and then see how that could change or not the results, at least in the post-pandemic, yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're next going to hear from Gordon Dahl about work from home and the employment of individuals with a disability.
Okay, thanks for having me here. This work is joint with a longtime co-author, Dan Olaf, who's from Stockholm University, and a newer co-author in Nick. And we're going to be looking at how work from home affects disability employment. So you may or may not be aware of this, but there's a massive gap in the employment of people with a disability, self-assessed disabilities. I'll get into what that means in just a second, and those who don't have a disability. This gap is almost 50 percentage points. It's been persistent for a long time. It's persistent and present in multiple countries. And this is, as I'll show you in just a second, bigger than any other demographic split. So this has raised an important question, which is some people say, well, maybe people who have a disability just don't have very much productivity, and so, this is just life, and that's how it is. There's not much we can do to change this gap. The other explanation, which the disability community has proffered for a long time, is we're not offered the accommodations that would allow us to contribute productively in the workforce. And so this is what I said. This is the disability employment gap. The top red line, which is dashed, is for people who do not have a disability. The bottom line in black is for people who self-state that they have a disability, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second. That's that 50 percentage point gap. Only a little over, roughly a third of people with a disability are working. This is prime-aged people, or people between the ages of 18 and 64. And look at any other group, gender, age, education, race, or nativity. Take different groups. There are gaps, but they're trivially small compared to this disability employment gap. Okay, so why, can we just say it's because they don't have productivity? Well, we would say reasonable accommodations. It's already required by law. The US has some of the strongest laws on the books for providing accommodations for people with a disability to work. And that would include remote work and flex time and assistive technologies. But what's happened in the US is that we have an out, which is if this would create undue or unreasonable expense, then you don't have to do it. And both the courts and the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission have largely sided with employers and saying, yeah, that's too expensive. So you have to do some things, but many things have not been done. And so before COVID, we just didn't have these accommodations for people with disabilities. Okay, and then of course, here we are with this transformational change in how work is conducted and how we do it not for people who have a disability. So this was not brought about by the ADA or demands for remote work, which has been demanded for a long time, but because we had this transformational shift due to COVID. And you already know that this has had a huge impact, so I won't spend a lot of time here. But the idea is work from home created unintentionally what people with a disability have been asking for a long time, which is the ability to have some flexibility. It's also true, which is sort of interesting, is this concept of universal design. This idea is you shouldn't treat people with a disability differently than you would treat people without a disability. They should have the same entrance to the workplace, not a back entrance with an elevator, but everyone should enter the same place. And so everyone has the ability to work from home, so you're not treating people with a disability differently. Okay, so what's my research question? There's been, as I'll show you in just a second, a massive increase in employment of individuals who have a disability. At the same time, we had this massive increase in work from home. So the real research question is, are these two related? Does work from home actually causally allow people with a disability to work more? Okay, so there's a related literature, which I'm going to skip in the interest of time, given this format. Let me just give you a preview of where I'm going. I won't be able to do everything equally detailed, so some of these things will be a little sparse on details. I hope you'll bear with me. Other parts I'll talk really fast. But we're going to try to show you what the world looks like before and after COVID. Then I'm going to try to see if I can link work from home to disability employment. Okay, and then if we have time, we'll get to some possible mechanisms which you can get at through wages. Okay, so we're going to start with definition of disability. We're going to be using CPS data. This is some of the best data that also has lots of employment outcomes in it. It's not ideally how everyone wants to measure disability, but it's what we have. It's better than many countries, unfortunately, in their data, but this is what we have. I won't go through all of them, but what they ask is, do you have a physical, mental, or emotional condition that would cause difficulty with your daily activities? And have disabled hearing, vision, ambulatory, self-care, and independent living as 5 of the types of questions. Like ambulatory would be, do you have difficulty walking or climbing stairs? Okay, so they're functional limitations, and these are self-reported. There's also one cognitive. This is where you have serious difficulty concentrating. I am not going to be looking at that today. When people have looked at this in the past, one of the things that you have to be a little careful about is the number of people who had what we're going to label cognitive disabilities has skyrocketed since COVID, either because COVID caused them or because we're more accepting of these type of things. That's going to create a problem for a design where you're trying to see what happened, because it could be these people who are now newly classified as having a disability have higher employability. So we can't have compositional shifts. So today, I'm not talking about label cognitive. Okay? So by the way, one thing which is really interesting, which not everyone recognizes, is remember the employability is only about a third. Only about a third of people with one of these disabilities we're talking about are employed. But it turns out that if you are employed, 78% of them are working part-time. That corresponds, or that can be compared to 85% of people who do not say they have a disability. So the gap is not that big, but the gap in any employment is huge. So that's an interesting fact that we'll grapple with. Okay, so this is an event, kind of a over time graph of how employment of individuals with disability looks, just shares, normalized to January 2019. What you can see is in the pre-COVID period, once normalized, they have very different means, pretty similar trends for people who have a disability and people who don't have a disability. They also sort of both got hammered by COVID. And then what you see is kind of post when the COVID problem is mostly over, we see a huge rise in disability employment. And what's happened to the rest of the workforce is about the same. Okay, so we're not the first to recognize this. That is not our, not our innovation. Other people have shown it. They've included the cognitive disability, so I think that could be a little misleading. But otherwise, I'm not going to claim that we came up with that. That's not the contribution of the paper. What I do want to say, though, is this rise in disability employment or of individuals with a disability. Once again, just don't see it in any other group. Like, okay, there's a little bit of a difference by gender, but relative, like this is just much bigger than any other differential change. Okay. By the way, you see similar increases in other countries. So I'm going to repeat the U.S. here. That's what I just showed you. No real change in non-disability employment over the pre-post period, kind of a long difference. big difference for people who declare they have a disability. Using whatever question we could come up with whatever OECD country we could capture, this is what we find for other countries, so a similar pattern, except for the UK, which had very generous furlough schemes. No one became unemployed during COVID in the UK. So that might be part of the explanation. But so this is not just the US. Okay, so if you decompose what's happening here, I rather than try to make you look at the different colored lines and see that, let me just explain what the point of this graph is. What's happened is we have started bringing people who are disabled into the labor force. We're not changing how many people who have a disability declare that they're unemployed. So this is about bringing people into the labor force when you decompose what's actually happening, that black increase that we were talking about, okay? So that's what you should have in mind. You shouldn't say, oh, there's a bunch of people who are in the labor force who are employed who couldn't find a job. That's not it. We're bringing people who weren't even looking into the labor force. Okay, so I'm going to use a little bit of that panel structure that was discussed by Maria. We're going to, I can't tell you what's happening to before and after COVID, because as was just explained, the CPS only goes, maximum a year difference in terms of knowing the information I need about disability and employment. But what I can do is I can see if the onset of a disability changes your employment before COVID versus after COVID. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to say, okay, take the set of people employed with no disabilities in the first wave of the survey. A year later, you get to see them again. Do they? And I'm going to start with people who don't have a disability and are working. Then I'm going to say, a year later, when I see you again, do you have a disability? And if you have a disability, I'd say you now have the onset of a disability. What are the chances that you're still working? And what you can see is in the pre-COVID period, it was about 71%. So a lot of these people kind of left the labor force after the onset of a disability. In the post-COVID period, though, you have far fewer people leaving the labor force. So that's about an 11% difference in the post versus pre-COVID period. So in other words, people are staying on their jobs post-COVID if they say they've acquired a disability. Okay, and if you looked at all the other differences, I could start doing some differences and differences. You can see that's just not true for people who didn't have a disability. But let me not spend more time on that. That's an interesting fact. You might have different explanations. You could have, but so I'm not going to get into that. But it's suggestive that you're allowing people to stay at work, and some suggestive evidence that you're also allowing people who weren't previously employed to come into the workforce after disability. But the main point of what I'm going to talk about today, and what I want to spend most of my time on, is whether there's a causal link. I haven't really said anything about work from home yet, have I? Except to say COVID, these two things both happened at the same time. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to now talk in whether or not work from home is what's driven the increase in disability employment that we've observed. Now, to start, I'm going to do an exercise that uses data from March to July 2023. This is that survey of workplace arrangements and attitudes, which Nick and Jose and Stephen, and I don't know Buckman's first name? Shelby. Oh, good to meet you. Shelby have put together. So thank you so much for putting this together and putting these questions and everything together for us, because it's wonderful to kind of show this. Now, in that survey, they ask, what were you doing last week? And then, does your current or most recent job allow you to work from home? And then there's this index of physical impairment that goes from 0 to 20. And if I had time, I'd tell you how it's constructed. But I just want you to know for today's purpose that 20 means lots of disabilities, lots of limitations in your physical activities. These are physical measures. And 0 means none. And then if you have 15, that's pretty bad. If you have 5, it's not so bad, et cetera. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about how the ability to work from home reduces the disability employment gap. So what I've got here on the x-axis is that scale of how bad are your physical limitations. 20 means a lot, 0 means a little. The y-axis is the probability of being in the labor force, either looking for a job or working. And let's start with people who have the ability to work from home, which are these blue dots. Okay? So what you can see is if you have no physical limitations, self-declared physical limitations, about 95% of those people are in the labor force. There's not a very steep gradient to that top line, is there? It maybe goes from 95 to 90% as you get from the least severe to the most severe set of disabilities. But if you don't have the self-declared ability to work from home, well, you have a lower mean to start. So these are different people, but you start out at about 80% labor force participation. But if you have a lot of disabilities, that goes down all the way to 20%. So in other words, there's a if you say I can't work from home, the more severe your disabilities, the way less likely you are to be in the labor force. So this is the first piece of evidence that there's just prima facie evidence that this is just staring us in the face that there might be a link, right? Now, what I want to do now is I want to try to get a more causal research design. That was a fact which is hard to ignore. Now I want to try to do a causal research design. Now, the idea is that work from home varies a lot by occupations, so we should see bigger increases in disability employment in work from home impacted occupations. That's the idea here. Now, the identifying assumption here that's different than what's been done in some of the papers is that changes in work from home, they can be driven by whatever supply and demand factors you want as long as it's not related to individuals with a disability. So I am perfectly fine in what I'm going to show you if, workers want more work from home, or if firms find it more efficient to have people work from home. Those are all supply and demand factors, but the identifying assumption is that it can't be changes in the supply and demand for non-disabled workers. Now, that's not a crazy assumption because workers with a disability account for about 3 to 4% of the labor force, so you have to sort of think that they're not the drivers. They were never the drivers before the pandemic, so we're sort of assuming they're not the drivers now. Now, this is an occupation level analysis because we don't observe an occupation unless you're employed. So we're going to be looking at changes in the number of employed at the occupation level. Now, in your mind, you should be thinking occupation switches are pretty hard to do. Most people do not get a disability. There's a graph later, if I get to it, until they get to be old, like me. So when you're in your 20s and your 30s, that's when people switch occupations. You don't switch occupations when you're 50 years old at a very high rate. There's not great data on this, but the best data we can find says that people just don't switch occupations. So you should sort of think someone gets a disability. You can't all of a sudden say, well, accountants can work from home, so I'm going to switch to accounting. That doesn't happen very often. So people have kind of a fixed occupation is kind of how we're thinking about it. Okay, now let me identify two of the big problems with this type of analysis and how we're going to try to treat with them. Changing composition, I already mentioned that, right? So the first thing we're going to do is you don't want people who were previously not classified as having a disability now coming in and messing up the composition of who it is. That's why we're excluding people with a cognitive disability. The newly classified cognitive disability people may have really high employability. That's not what we're trying to capture here. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that group, which we shouldn't be looking at. Be interesting to study, we just can't. The other thing we'll do is we'll reweight based on observables to see if it matters. The answer is not really. But on all the observables we can, we'll see if any of that has changed. Okay, so that's identification challenge number one. This is, by the way, just showing you with a cognitive disability. We went from about 6 million to about 7.5 million people with a cognitive disability pre-post-COVID. So that's why we can't do it. You might also notice there's something interesting here. Can you see during the COVID period that it looks like there's fewer people with a disability, even with what I'm calling the physical disabilities? That's because the CPS had so much trouble identifying and interviewing people who had a disability, and their weights didn't adjust for this. It adjusted for other factors. So if my one advice to you is if you want to study what happened to people with a disability during COVID, the CPS is unfortunately kind of screwed up. And I don't know what the right weights are, and they have not provided correct weights. So you'd have to solve that problem. So studying this question during COVID is also something we're not going to do because things are really messed up during COVID. People with a disability wouldn't answer the questions. Okay, so what's the second big identification challenge? The second big challenge is that there was a big change in labor market tightness. So if you look at things put out by the Federal Reserve or other data sources, the aggregate labor market tightness increased by 60%. After COVID. So you might think that some of that was related to work from homeable and which occupations were hit by how tight the labor market is. So if vacancies increase relative to employment, which they did, this could make firms more willing to hire disadvantaged workers, including workers with disability. We don't want that messing things up. So what we're going to do is we're going to control flexibly for non-disabled employment with an occupation. Why can I do that? That seems like I'm doing, on the right-hand side, I've got the same thing I have on the left-hand side, except this is for people. This is what I said. It's fine if changes in the demand and supply was driven by people without a disability, and I can control for that as flexibly as I want. So I'm going to flexibly control for changes in non-disability employment at the occupation level and assume that that's orthogonal to, what the disabled population is doing. Okay. The other thing that I'll do is I'll instrument with this measure, which has been mentioned several times, the Dingle and Nyman measure of like the predetermined ability of a job to be done remotely. remotely. Okay, this is going to be a long difference. I'm going to be looking at what happens in the latest 2 years post-COVID, so after we know we're not messed up by COVID, and the years prior to COVID, and I will show you what we get. Okay, this is an occupation level analysis. How am I going to define work from home? I'm going to be using the ACS transportation question, which most of you know, so I won't spend more time on it. It's what we have that we can measure both before and after. I'll show you some robustness, some other measures if we have time. We're going to calculate work from home rates using this question by occupation, once again, only using non-disabled workers. We don't want that to create a bias. Okay, so you might not be able to see the light blue, but as all of you know, huge increases in work from home. Some in more occupations than others. Like teachers only went up by 4 percentage points. They didn't have a lot of remote work to begin with. You really can't do that job remotely. Computer specialists went up 36 percentage points. So that's sort of the variation or the idea of what we're going to be using here. Okay, these are some alternative definitions from work from home that I'll get to if I can, some job ads or the telework question if we have some time. Okay, so let me make sure you understand this regression. It's incredibly simple. It's at the occupation level. The left-hand side variable is the percentage change in the employment of individuals with a disability. So you say, how many people with a disability in occupations are employed in the post-period minus the pre-period divided by the pre-period. That's all. That's as simple as it is. The right-hand side variable is the change in the ability to work from home in the pre versus the post-period for the years we can do it. Okay? That's what the regression is. And then, of course, I said we try to go a step further and control for labor market tightness. And we're going to do that by including the same variables we have on the left-hand side, but for people who do not have a disability. So the percentage change in an occupation for people who do not have a disability in flexibly. So third-order polynomial. You can get a flexibly. Okay. We'll also do propensity score reweighting. If you still have compositional concerns, let me show you some results in the last 10 minutes or so. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is just that simple regression with no controls. So I don't control for labor market tightness or compositional reweight. And just so you understand how to interpret these coefficients, 1.114 means that if you had a 1 percentage point increase in the ability to work from home in your occupation, employment in a disability employment in that occupation rises by 1%. Okay? Now, if I add in controls for labor market tightness, or I composition reweight, or I do both of them, this is kind of my preferred column, column 4, it says, yeah, if you have a 1 percentage point increase in the probability to work from home, you're going to have a 1% increase in disability employment. That, by the way, you might say, how big is that? Well, the average increase in a change in the ability to work from home was 9 percentage points. You know, I told you teachers had low increase, computer specialists had a big increase, but the average was 9%. So another way to kind of interpret this is that we can explain 67% of that rise in disability employment through the ability to work from home. This is not a trivial component of why people with a disability are now working and were not before. This is explaining 2/3 of the effect. Okay, now what you can do in these final columns is kind of the same exercise, but if you want to, and I don't quite know what the worry would be, it's not an endogeneity concern if you buy our assumption about non-disabled workers not driving supply and demand. We're not using them. But we can still instrument for can the occupation be done remotely with this predetermined measure by Dingle and Nyman. And big first stage, you get pretty similar estimates. They're a little bit bigger. They're noisier, as IV estimates often are. And I think this is because the way that we're measuring work from home is that ACS transportation question. So there's probably some measurement error. And once you get rid of that measurement error in how remotable a workplace is, the coefficient's a little bit bigger. But, you know, it's 30% bigger. So kind of two different ways to deal with endogeneity or omitted variable bias, or what I really just think is measurement error. Okay, so now you might say maybe you just excluded cognitive ability as the one disability, you know, because you didn't like the results. No, if anything, when you include cognitive disorders, the results get bigger. But once again, I'm not sure that's causal, right, because of the compositional changes. You know, we can composition reweight, but it's not obvious exactly that we have the right controls. So, but we're not cheating there. What about total full-time or part-time? Let me just summarize. Remember, 78% of these of people with a disability are working full-time. So that's most of it. I've been showing you results for full-time. There's really no effect for part-time employment. Now, what I can't say is whether or not people in the labor force are jumping right into full-time or staying in full-time, or if some people are exiting non-employment and becoming part-time, and some part-time are becoming full-time. But the point is, I can't see an effect on the part-time margin. It's all the full-time margin that we're seeing things for. Okay, alternative definitions. I'll do this quickly. This is some data which Nick was able to share with us, job ads from Lightcast. Number of job ads which mention home by occupation pre and post-COVID. So let me show you what happens if you do that. If you do that and you use that as your measure of the change in work from home ability, you kind of get to column 4. And if anything, you find a very similar point estimate, but you should actually scale it because there's a smaller increase. So you find, if anything, a larger effect using that measure, job ads. Now, when you do the instrument for job ads, so you instrument with Dingle and Nyman in these last 3 columns, you will get much bigger estimates. And that's probably because job ads have even more measurement area in them, right? So our jobs at UCSD do not mention you can work from home, but you can. So that might be why the IV kind of bumps up those estimates even more. Okay, so in other words, I was just trying to show you it's robust, or if anything, bigger if you use an alternative measure. What I want to spend the last few minutes on before I open it up for questions is a simple model, and we're only going to have some indirect evidence on this. But is this due to supply or demand factors? Here's what I mean by supply. Work from home could lower the cost of working for individuals with a disability. So it may be that I'd like to go to work, but all of these psychic costs or transportation costs to getting to work. Nick has talked to people that say, we need bathrooms, and it doesn't work in the workplace. When I can work from home, that works. Or I don't get noise. It's not just stairs and commuting costs. But all of these things could create problems that make it so that when you're saying, like, I could earn $23 an hour, but in a per hour basis, it's like $3 of cost to work if I have a disability. If work from home gets rid of those $3 in costs, all of a sudden a bunch of people who are earning who could earn between $20 and $23 will now start working, right? Now I said this really kind of trickily, but if that's true, what should we see? We should see marginal people remaining and new marginal workers entering who have lower wages on average. So that's the first prediction. Wages should be lower if it's labor supply. Now, labor demand, this would be that work from home could lower the cost of employing workers with a disability or increase their productivity. This is different because this says the employer pays the cost of hiring a person with a disability. So now, you would have paid the worker $23, but you have to incur $3 of cost, so you only pay them $20. So their actual wage, which is reported in the CPS, is 20, whereas in the previous example, it was 23, right? And so if it lowers the cost of employing workers, then what I should see is a rise in wages. Because now when I pay the worker, the productivity minus the costs I have to incur as an employer. If those costs disappear, now wages should go up. You could get a similar story if there's an increase in productivity of disabled workers. I can't tell the difference between those two. But I know I did that quickly. I know I didn't kind of lay out the assumptions of the simple model here, but there are assumptions which will more carefully verify what I just said. But the idea is that if the labor supply channel is true, newly employed individuals should have lower wages. If the labor demand channel operates, then it should be higher wages. So that's the prediction I'm going to test. Now, you might say, is this about the incidence of a tax? No. It's like literally who's paying the cost. Is it the worker, or is it the firm, or is it productivity, right? So I'm not talking about incidence of this now. I'm talking about who's paying, and that will tell me whether it's labor supply or labor demand. You have to wrap your head around it, and I know I've said it quickly, but that's the idea of the test. So let's see what we find. What we find is that if you have a disability and you're in a high work from home occupation in the pre-period, $26 an hour and 4 cents. In the post-period, wages actually fell by about 2%. So they didn't rise for high work from home occupations. That's the opposite of what happened for workers without a disability. Their wages actually went up modestly, okay, in high work from home occupations. You now compare that to low work from home occupations. Their wages actually rose. So the difference in difference is the only thing I really know how to interpret. And that says, so if you were in a high work from home occupation versus a low work from home occupation, post minus pre-COVID, your wages actually fell. And if anything, they actually rose for people without a disability. So you do the triple difference if you like those. The point is, it looks like we're starting to bring in marginal workers or keep marginal workers in the labor force who have lower wages, which suggests it's labor supply. And that's, I think, where I'll probably end. So I'll have, well, let me just say maybe why I think this is important. This, we're talking, there's been so many papers about how, remote work has changed the labor market. And we focused a lot on those workers. A really important group of people are people who have disabilities. And they've largely been kind of sidelined for years, not able to work. This is really transformational for them because it's affecting where, when, and how their work gets done in ways they've been asking for, but maybe it couldn't have made a difference. This is not a trivial effect, and sort of to what Nick said a little bit ago, I think moving forward, work from home could have even larger impacts as firms continue to develop and adopt remote work technologies, as people stop leaving their jobs once they get a disability because they can remain employed. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. The other thing why I think this is kind of important is it doesn't just benefit individuals with a disability, but there's a lot of financial policies in place, which we spend a fair amount of money on, that there's a positive fiscal externality here as well. So let me end there and see if there are any questions.
This was awesome. I was curious about the work from home rates by disability status, because I think another potential interpretation of the last result is that you have people who previously would have gone to the office, and now they stay home, and there's lots of evidence that then you don't have the promotion opportunities you would have before. So, yeah.
Yeah. So one thing, I don't know if this is a perfectly satisfying answer, but it turns out that prior to the work from home, actually, if anything, work from home rates for people with a disability were a little lower in most occupations. So it's not like pre-pandemic, a bunch of people were working from home, and now post-pandemic they're not. But it is still interesting to think about how being physically in the office will affect kind of long-term promotion rates. That I don't think we know the answer to yet because it hasn't been long enough. But
Yeah,
I think
totally
the first point is we don't have, it's not true that that people with a disability are concentrated in occupations that are more remote workable from home. And that makes sense once you think about it's 50-year-olds who have a disability. It's not 20-year-olds who have a disability. So it's not like your whole life you're like, I'm going to have a disability when I'm 50, so I'm going to choose to be an accountant. So it really goes with that model of you have an occupation, then you get a disability, and you're like, oh, can I still do it?
Very cool paper. Two questions. I'd love to see these results broken down by that disability bucket because I'm kind of curious what those really are in there. And then if I have a psychiatric disorder, I have an anxiety disorder, is that fall under
That's going to be, most people would interpret that as cognitive, and that increased massively with COVID, so we can't
so
look
do
at
you
it.
think some of these are psychiatric issues as opposed to, when I hear cognitive, I think of dementia and Alzheimer's. I don't think
you can
major depression.
relabel. You can relabel it's literally, do you have difficulty remembering, processing things, or, right? So it's mental tasks. So if you want to call it mental, that's as close as we have. That's sort of like saying this is not the perfect question, right? But your point's well taken on both. But I wish we could say something about that, but we just can't. Or I don't think we can causally, because that group just skyrocketed because of COVID.
But you can break down the first
We
five
could do the first
categories,
five.
so, yeah.
Except you have to be a little careful. When you slice the data too thin, we run out of precision. So maybe two groups or something. It's a good idea.